I remember the day we moved into Oakwood Heights like it was yesterday. The pristine lawns, the matching mailboxes, the sense of order that seemed to promise safety and community. My wife Julia had fallen in love with the Spanish-style home on Maple Lane, with its terracotta roof and modest garden that offered just enough space for her beloved roses. The real estate agent had mentioned something about a very active homeowners association with a slight grimace, but we were too enchanted by the neighborhood to pay much attention. They just make sure everyone maintains their properties, she had assured us, keeps the property values high. How naive we were back then, believing that was all there was to it. For the first few months, everything seemed perfect. We received the HOA handbook, a 70-page document outlining every conceivable rule about exterior paint colors, acceptable holiday decorations, and lawn maintenance schedules. I found it somewhat excessive, but reasoned that these regulations were what kept the neighborhood looking so immaculate. Then my sister Rebecca called with news that changed our comfortable existence. She had lost her job after her company downsized and needed a place to stay while she regrouped. "Just for a few months," she promised, "until I can get back on my feet." Of course, I said yes immediately. Rebecca and I had always been close, despite her mysterious government job that she could never quite explain in detail. Rebecca moved into our guest room on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, I received the first email from the HOA board requesting information about the unregistered occupant in our home. I was disturbed by how quickly they had noticed, but complied with their request to register her as a temporary resident. Rebecca was quiet and unassuming, spending most days in the guest room with her laptop, occasionally taking encrypted phone calls in hushed tones. She explained that she was doing remote consulting work for her previous employer, a government contractor, but could not share details due to confidentiality agreements. I respected her privacy and was simply glad to help her through a difficult time. As weeks passed, I noticed a shift in the neighborhood atmosphere. The HOA board, led by President Douglas Warren, had recently hired a private security company to enforce community guidelines. These men and women patrolled in black SUVs with Oakwood Heights security emblazoned on the sides, though residents had taken to calling them HOA cops behind their backs. Warren, a former middle manager who had found his calling in micromanaging the lives of his neighbors, seemed to take particular pleasure in the growing power of his position. The first sign of trouble came when I received a citation for leaving my garbage bins visible from the street for 2 hours longer than permitted. The following week, it was a warning about the height of Julia's rose bushes exceeding the maximum allowable garden height by 3 inches. These seemed like minor annoyances until I witnessed our elderly neighbor Mrs. Patel in tears after receiving a $200 fine because her grandson's bicycle had been visible in her driveway during an HOA inspection. Something was changing in our once peaceful community, and not for the better. Security patrols increased, with vehicles slowly cruising past homes at all hours, taking photographs of potential violations. At the monthly HOA meeting, attendance had dwindled as Warren and his board enacted increasingly restrictive policies without meaningful opposition. Those who did speak up found themselves targeted for enhanced scrutiny in the following weeks. I kept my head down, hopping to avoid attention, especially with Rebecca staying with us. There was something about the way security lingered near our home that made me uneasy. One evening, I overheard Rebecca on the phone. "They are definitely escalating surveillance on the block, not sure if it is related or just overzealous civilian authority." She noticed me in the doorway and quickly ended the call. "Just work stuff," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You know how it is with government contracts." I did not know, actually, but I nodded anyway. What I did know was that our quiet suburban life was beginning to feel less like a community and more like a pressure cooker, with the HOA turning up the heat day by day. In retrospect, I should have seen what was coming. The HOA had been testing boundaries for months, seeing how far they could push before residents pushed back. Most of us were too busy with our daily lives to mount any meaningful resistance. We complained to each other in hushed conversations while retrieving our mail or walking our dogs, but publicly we complied. We paid the arbitrary fines, trimmed our gardens to exactly 18 inches, and made sure no garbage bin remained visible for even 1 minute past collection day. We had surrendered our community to tyranny dressed up as property value protection, and we were about to learn exactly what that surrender would cost us. I had been at work when I received a frantic call from our next-door neighbor, Helen. "They have taken your sister," she said, her voice shaking. "The HOA security, they have her in handcuffs in your front yard." I dropped everything and raced home, my heart pounding against my ribs. The 15-minute drive felt like hours as my mind conjured worst-case scenarios. What could Rebecca have possibly done to warrant this kind of response? When I turned onto Maple Lane, the scene that greeted me was surreal. 3 black HOA security SUVs with flashing yellow lights were parked haphazardly in front of our house. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching as 2 security guards stood on either side of Rebecca, who was indeed handcuffed and looking surprisingly calm given the circumstances. Douglas Warren himself was there. His perpetual scowl deepened into something approaching glee as he gestured emphatically at my sister. I slammed my car into park and rushed toward them. "What is happening here?" I demanded, my voice breaking with panic and anger. "Why is my sister in handcuffs? You cannot do this." Warren turned to me with the satisfied expression of a small-time dictator who had finally found a worthy transgression. "Your sister has violated multiple HOA regulations," he announced loudly, clearly performing for the assembled neighbors. "Operating a business from a residence without proper registration and approval, suspicious activity, unauthorized use of community resources." "What suspicious activity? What community resources?" I looked at Rebecca, whose expression was unnervingly serene. "This is insane. You cannot detain people. You are not actual law enforcement." One of the security guards, a muscular man with a crew cut who looked like he had failed the real police academy entrance exam, stepped toward me. "Sir, I need you to step back or you will also be detained for obstruction." "Obstruction of what? HOA rules are not laws. You cannot arrest people." I was shouting now, unable to contain my disbelief at the absurdity unfolding on my front lawn. Warren smirked. "Our community bylaws, which you signed when purchasing your property, clearly state that Oakwood Heights Security is authorized to temporarily detain individuals found in violation of community standards until proper authorities can be contacted." He was reciting this as if reading from a sacred text, his voice reverent with power. Rebecca spoke for the first time, her voice steady. "I would like to retrieve my phone and identification from inside the house." Her calmness was incongruous with the chaotic scene. "That will not be necessary," Warren replied. "We have already contacted the police regarding your unauthorized activities." Rebecca's eyes met mine, and she gave me the slightest nod. "These individuals," she said carefully, "are making a career-ending mistake. I would strongly advise them to allow me to retrieve my identification before this escalates further." The security guard laughed. "Is that a threat? Add that to the report." He turned to his colleague. "Let us get her in the vehicle until police arrive." As they moved toward the SUV, I frantically pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "I need police at 1423 Maple Lane immediately," I told the dispatcher. "Private security personnel have handcuffed my sister and are attempting to detain her. They are not law enforcement." The dispatcher promised to send officers right away, but I could hear the confusion in her voice. This was not a typical emergency call. While waiting for the police, I remembered something Rebecca had told me when she first moved in. "If anything unusual ever happens," she had said, "I have emergency contacts in the blue folder in my desk drawer." At the time, I had attributed this to her general cautiousness, but now her words took on new urgency. "I need to get something from inside," I told Warren, who was busy documenting the scene with his phone camera. "You are not going anywhere until police arrive," he responded without looking up. "Douglas," I said, using his first name deliberately, "you have absolutely no legal authority to prevent me from entering my own home. If you or your security team attempts to physically stop me, that is false imprisonment and assault." Law school may have been 15 years behind me, but some principles remained crystal clear. My confident tone gave him pause. After a moment of consideration, he nodded to the security guards. Let him get whatever he needs. Monitor the situation. The implied threat was clear, but I did not care. I rushed inside and straight to the guest room. The blue folder was exactly where Rebecca had said it would be. Inside, I found several documents with government letterheads and a business card with a number and an unusual seal I did not recognize. Without hesitation, I dialed the number. "Office of Critical Infrastructure," a crisp voice answered. "How may I direct your call?" "My name is Michael Chen," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. "My sister Rebecca Chen is being detained by private security at our residence in Oakwood Heights. She asked me to call this number in case of emergency." The line went silent for a moment. Then, "What is your exact location, Mr. Chen?" I provided our address, and the voice simply responded, "Remain on site. Do not interfere further. Personnel are being dispatched. Estimated arrival time 7 minutes." The call ended before I could ask any questions. When I returned outside, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Rebecca remained handcuffed beside the security vehicle, but she now wore a small smile that seemed to unnerve the guards. Warren was packing, checking his watch repeatedly. "The police should be here by now," he muttered. As if summoned by his words, 2 police cruisers turned onto Maple Lane, lights flashing but sirens silent. 4 officers approached our unusual gathering with cautious professionalism. "What seems to be the situation here?" the lead officer asked, taking in the scene with evident confusion. Warren immediately stepped forward. "Officer, we have detained this woman for multiple violations of our Homeowners Association regulations. She has been operating an unauthorized business from this residence and engaging in suspicious activities." The officer looked from Warren to the security guards to Rebecca in handcuffs, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. "Sir, are you law enforcement?" "No, but as HOA president." "Then why is this woman in handcuffs?" the officer interrupted. "Our bylaws clearly state." "Sir, only law enforcement officers have the authority to detain individuals and place them in restraints," the officer stated firmly. He turned to the security guards. "Remove those handcuffs immediately." As the security guard reluctantly complied, Rebecca rubbed her wrists and addressed the officer. "Thank you. I would like to retrieve my identification from inside the house, if I may." The officer nodded, and Rebecca walked calmly into our home. The ensuing minutes stretched with uncomfortable silence as Warren and his security team exchanged nervous glances. When Rebecca returned, she was holding a leather wallet that she opened to reveal an identification card unlike any I had seen before. She presented it to the officer, who studied it with growing alarm. He looked up at Rebecca with newfound respect, and then back at Warren with something approaching pity. "Mr. Warren," the officer said slowly, "this woman is a federal government contractor with high-level security clearance. She works in cybersecurity for critical infrastructure protection and has an active Secret Service protection detail due to the nature of her work." Warren's face drained of color. "There must be some mistake." "There is indeed a mistake," Rebecca interjected calmly. "You made it when you decided to detain a federal contractor working on matters of national security because her home office setup violated HOA aesthetic guidelines." She turned to the officer. "Additional personnel will be arriving momentarily. I would appreciate if everyone remained on site until they arrive." As if on cue, 3 unmarked black SUVs, real ones, not the HOA's pretend version, turned onto Maple Lane and smoothly parked in perfect formation. Men and women in suits emerged, their movements synchronized and purposeful. Several wore subtle earpieces, and all carried themselves with the unmistakable authority of federal agents. The lead agent, a tall woman with close-cropped silver hair, approached our group. "Ms. Chen," she acknowledged Rebecca with a respectful nod before turning to assess the situation. "I am Agent Catherine Harlow, Special Security Coordinator." She did not specify which agency she represented, and no one dared to ask. Rebecca briefly explained what had occurred. As she spoke, other agents moved through the area, photographing the HOA security vehicles, documenting the badges and identification of the security personnel and taking statements from neighbors who had witnessed the incident. Warren, now visibly sweating despite the cool evening air, attempted to reassert himself. "This is all a misunderstanding. If we had known Ms. Chen's position." Agent Harlow cut him off with a raised hand. "Mr. Warren, is that correct? You authorized the detention of a resident without legal authority to do so." "Our HOA bylaws clearly state." "HOA bylaws do not supersede federal law, Mr. Warren. Impersonating law enforcement officers, falsely imprisoning a citizen, and interfering with a federal contractor performing essential functions related to national security are serious offenses." Harlow's voice remained measured, but the weight of her words was unmistakable. The HOA security guards had gone pale, one visibly trembling as an agent photographed his badge and identification card. The local police officers had stepped back, clearly wanting no association with what was now obviously a significant legal overreach by the HOA. "We were just doing our jobs," one of the guards protested weakly. "That explanation has historically proven insufficient," Agent Harlow replied without emotion. She turned to the police officers. "We will need copies of any reports filed regarding this incident. Our office will be in contact with your department to coordinate next steps." Rebecca stood beside me, watching the scene unfold with the calm of someone who had witnessed far more dramatic situations. She leaned close and whispered, "I am sorry for bringing this to your doorstep, but perhaps it is not entirely unfortunate. This neighborhood has needed a reckoning for some time." I could only nod in stunned agreement as I watched the neighborhood tyrants who had made our lives increasingly miserable over the past year realize that they had finally bullied the wrong person. Warren's face cycled through emotions: indignation, disbelief, and finally, the dawning horror of comprehending the consequences that awaited him. The transformation of our neighborhood began almost immediately after the incident. Within 24 hours, federal investigators had established a temporary office in our community center, interviewing residents about their experiences with the HOA board and security personnel. People who had suffered in silence for years suddenly found their voices, sharing stories of intimidation, selective rule enforcement, and abuse of authority. 3 days after Rebecca's detention, every member of the HOA board received hand-delivered letters outlining potential legal charges stemming from years of overreach. The letters detailed specific violations of federal and state law, including operating an unlicensed security force, falsely claiming law enforcement authority, selective enforcement constituting harassment, and in Warren's case, misappropriation of HOA funds for personal expenses. The community email list, once dominated by Warren's proclamations of new rules and fine schedules, exploded with resident discussions. Years of financial records were subpoenaed, revealing that our HOA fees had been funding not just the security force, but also executive retreats for board members and landscaping services for their personal properties that were classified as demonstration gardens. Rebecca continued her work from our home, now with an occasional security detail parked discreetly on our street. She maintained professional discretion about her actual responsibilities, but explained enough for me to understand that she monitored potential cybersecurity threats to power grids and water treatment facilities. "The HOA detention incident has been classified as a security breach," she told me over breakfast one morning. "Which means a full investigation is not just warranted, but required." The slight smile that accompanied this statement suggested she was not entirely displeased with this development. Warren attempted damage control, calling an emergency HOA meeting where he claimed ignorance of security personnel overstepping their authority. "We have always operated with the community's best interests at heart," he insisted to a room full of residents who had recently learned about the demonstration garden, expenses charged to their HOA fees. The meeting devolved when Mrs. Patel, our elderly neighbor, stood up and detailed how she had been threatened with foreclosure over her grandson's bicycle. One by one, residents shared similar stories, creating a damning pattern that even Warren's most loyal supporters could not defend. As the investigation progressed, we learned that the security company had never been properly licensed to operate in our county. The guards carried badges that closely resembled police identification, a deliberate misrepresentation that violated state law. Most disturbingly, the board had installed surveillance cameras throughout the neighborhood without proper disclosure to residents, monitoring far more than just rule violations. The most satisfying development came when a real estate attorney, whose sister lived in our community, held a free consultation session for residents. "Your HOA has been operating well beyond its legal authority," she explained to the packed community center. "Many of the fines levied against residents over the past 3 years were for rules that were never properly ratified according to your own bylaws. Those funds may be recoverable." Rebecca, though still maintaining a low profile, became something of a neighborhood hero. Residents would leave thank-you notes in our mailbox or stop me in the street to express their gratitude. "We were all too afraid to stand up to them," Helen confided one evening. "It took someone they could not intimidate to break the spell." An interim HOA board was established, comprised of residents who had frequently challenged Warren's policies. Their first action was to dismiss the security company and institute a transparent financial reporting system accessible to all homeowners. Community meetings that had once been sparsely attended became forums for constructive engagement about genuine neighborhood concerns like playground improvements and emergency preparedness plans. The former board members faced consequences beyond the legal troubles. Warren, once proud of his position as HOA president, now hurried to his car with head bowed when neighbors approached. The security chief was reportedly seeking employment in another state. Most significantly, the culture of fear that had permeated Oakwood Heights dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of actual community. Residents who had never spoken to each other now gathered for impromptu cookouts and formed walking groups. Children played in front yards that had previously been forbidden territory. Gardens flourished beyond their previously mandated heights. The neighborhood had been liberated from a mini-tyranny that had grown so gradually most residents had not recognized how oppressive it had become until it was suddenly lifted. "Communities are fragile things," Rebecca observed as we watched a group of neighbors helping Mrs. Patel install a basketball hoop for her grandson. "They require vigilance not just against external threats, but against the small corruptions of power that happen when no one is paying attention." 6 months after the handcuff incident, as it had come to be known in neighborhood lore, the formal legal proceedings against Warren and the former security chief began. I took a rare day off work to attend the initial court hearing, finding myself in a courtroom filled with Oakwood Heights residents. Rebecca was scheduled to testify, accompanied by Agent Harlow and another federal official whose role was never clearly explained. Warren and the security chief sat at the defense table, diminished versions of their formerly imposing selves. The contrast between their previous swagger and current humbled demeanor was stark. Warren, who once strutted through neighborhood meetings like a general inspecting troops, now hunched his shoulders as if trying to disappear into his ill-fitting suit. The prosecutors outlined a case that went far beyond the detention of Rebecca. They had uncovered a pattern of behavior that included intimidation, selective enforcement targeting residents who challenged board decisions, and financial improprieties that bordered on embezzlement. The HOA had been operated less as a community organization and more as a personal fiefdom, with Warren and his allies using fear and intimidation to maintain control. When Rebecca took the stand, she spoke with clinical precision about the events of that evening. She explained her work in general terms, cybersecurity consultation for critical infrastructure protection, without revealing classified details. She described the detention calmly, without embellishment, which somehow made the absurdity of the situation even more apparent. "And in your professional assessment," the prosecutor asked, "how would you characterize the actions of the defendants?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "In security analytics, we have a concept called escalation of authority. It describes how systems designed for limited oversight gradually expand their control mechanisms until they fundamentally alter the environment they were meant to merely monitor. What I observed in Oakwood Heights was a textbook case of this phenomenon, but implemented by individuals rather than systems." Expert witnesses testified about how the HOA had systematically exceeded its legal authority, using intimidation tactics that did indeed border on racketeering. A forensic accountant detailed the financial mismanagement, showing spreadsheets where homeowner fines were directly correlated with expressions of dissent at HOA meetings. The judge, an older woman with penetrating eyes and little patience for procedural delays, frequently interrupted the defense's attempts to characterize the situation as a simple misunderstanding. When Warren's attorney suggested that the board had been acting to maintain community standards, the judge removed her glasses and leaned forward. "Counselor," she said, "homeowners associations exist to maintain shared spaces and represent collective homeowner interests. They are not private governments. They have no law enforcement authority. They cannot detain citizens. This court is deeply troubled by the evidence suggesting your clients believed otherwise." After 2 weeks of testimony, the judge delivered her verdict and sentencing. Warren and the security chief were found guilty on multiple charges, including impersonation of law enforcement, false imprisonment, and harassment. The sentences included community service, significant financial penalties, and a lifetime ban from serving in any HOA or security capacity. In her closing remarks, the judge addressed the defendants directly. "The court recognizes that homeowners associations serve an important function in many communities. However, when those entrusted with this responsibility confuse authority with power, service with control, they undermine the very community they claim to protect. This case should serve as a reminder that no position of authority, however small it may seem in the grand scheme of governance, is exempt from the fundamental principles of justice, transparency, and respect for individual rights." As we filed out of the courtroom, I noticed residents exchanging quiet smiles of satisfaction. This was not celebration of others' downfall, but relief at seeing justice properly administered after years of neighborhood tyranny. Outside, several homeowners from adjacent communities approached us, asking about how they might address similar issues in their own HOAs. The impact of what had happened in Oakwood Heights was already spreading beyond our neighborhood boundaries. 1 year after Rebecca's detention, our neighborhood is unrecognizable from the tightly controlled environment it once was. The new HOA operates with minimal intrusion and maximum transparency, focusing on community enhancement rather than punitive enforcement. Monthly meetings are well attended, not out of fear, but genuine interest in neighborhood improvements and social events. Rebecca has moved on to a new assignment in Washington, but returns for occasional visits. Neighbors who never knew her full role in government service still greet her as the catalyst who transformed our community. The swing set in Mrs. Patel's backyard that would have once resulted in multiple citations is now the gathering place for neighborhood children. Gardens have expanded beyond their previously mandated boundaries, creating a more natural and vibrant streetscape. Property values, contrary to Warren's dire predictions about maintaining standards, have actually increased as Oakwood Heights gained a reputation as a friendly, welcoming community. Some former board members have found unexpected redemption. The former treasurer, who admitted to being intimidated by Warren into approving questionable expenditures, now leads workshops for other HOAs about financial transparency and ethical governance. Several of our residents have been invited to speak at regional homeowner rights conferences, sharing lessons learned from our experience. The most profound change is invisible but omnipresent, the disappearance of fear from daily life in our community. No one worries about putting their garbage bins out too early or leaving a garden hose visible from the street. Children play freely in front yards that were once subject to aesthetic regulations. Neighbors engage in genuine conversations rather than nervous exchanges about potential rule violations. Last month, we held a neighborhood celebration in the community park, ironically, in violation of several of the old HOA's rules about gatherings. Residents from surrounding communities attended, many seeking advice about addressing similar issues in their own HOAs. The event featured a legal rights workshop, document templates for HOA reform, and most importantly, stories shared by people who had found the courage to question authority that had grown too powerful. I watched as Julia chatted with Mrs. Patel, who was teaching her about growing the Indian herbs that now flourished in her previously regulation height garden. Nearby, children played on grass that had once been subject to weekly measurement inspections. The community that had been suffocating under arbitrary rule enforcement now breathed freely, having learned a powerful lesson about the balance between standards and freedom. Rebecca called that evening, and I described the celebration to her. "You know," she said, "in my work, we focus on protecting systems from external threats, but sometimes the greatest threat to a system's health comes from within, from mechanisms designed for protection that eventually become the danger themselves." She paused. "I am glad something good came from my little career detour to your guest room." I think about her words often as I walk through our transformed neighborhood. Communities, like any living system, require the right balance of structure and freedom, of standards and individuality. When we surrender that balance to those who value control above all else, we lose something essential about what makes a collection of homes into a true community. It takes vigilance to maintain that balance, and sometimes, just occasionally, it takes someone with the right credentials being handcuffed at exactly the right moment to restore it.